In November of 1917, tens of thousands of American soldiers began arriving in a small, muddy corner of Belgium near the Meuse River, exhausted, cold, and hungry, having just crossed an ocean to fight a war that was not originally theirs. Entire villages had already been leveled by 3 years of shelling. Roughly 9 million soldiers would die before the war was over, and millions more would come home missing limbs, lungs, or their minds. Along the front lines in Belgium, local vendors set up small carts near the trenches, selling strips of fried potato wrapped in paper to soldiers who had nothing else warm to eat. The American troops loved it immediately. There was just one problem. The people serving it to them were speaking French, because that is one of Belgium's official languages, and the exhausted, half-frozen Americans simply assumed they were in France. They were not. They were in Belgium. But the name stuck anyway, and it stuck so hard that more than a century later, billions of people around the world still call this dish by the name of a country that almost certainly did not invent it. Roughly 11 billion pounds of frozen potatoes are processed into fries every single year in the United States alone, and the global fast food industry now depends on a product that most historians believe was born not in Paris, but in the working-class river towns of Belgium, generations before the French had anything to do with it. So how did a plate of fried potatoes, cooked by farmers along a Belgian river, end up wearing the name of a country next door? And how did it go on to become one of the single most consumed foods on the campaign, a fixture of nearly every fast food menu, and at one point, an actual instrument of American diplomacy? This story does not start in Paris. It starts almost 400 years earlier, in the river valleys of what is now southern Belgium, and it starts, of all places, with fish. The story of the potato itself, before it ever met hot oil, begins thousands of years earlier and an ocean away, high in the Andes Mountains of South America, in the region that is now Peru and Bolivia. Archaeological evidence suggests that indigenous peoples in this region were cultivating wild potatoes as early as 8,000 years ago, and by roughly the year 100 BCE, communities in the Andes had domesticated hundreds of distinct potato varieties, in colors ranging from deep purple to bright yellow to a red so dark it looked almost black. These were not the smooth, uniform potatoes you would recognize from a grocery store today. Some were bright yellow, some were deep purple, some were red. They were lumpy, irregular, and often bitter, and some wild varieties were even mildly toxic if not prepared correctly. The Andean peoples solved this problem through a technique called chuño, a freeze-drying process that used the extreme temperature swings of high-altitude nights and days to leach out toxins and preserve the potato for years at a time. The process worked roughly like this. Potatoes were left outside overnight at altitudes often above 12,000 feet, where nighttime temperatures could drop well below freezing. The frost drew moisture and bitter compounds out of the tubers. The next day, workers, often entire families, would walk barefoot across the potatoes, pressing out the remaining water and loosened skins by foot. Repeated over several days of freezing nights and sun-drying afternoons, this cycle produced a lightweight, wrinkled, almost rock-hard product that could be stored for years without spoiling. They did not know the word chemistry. They did not know the word dehydration in any scientific sense. They were doing it anyway. This was not a minor convenience. In a world without refrigeration, at an altitude where few other crops could survive, the potato was often the difference between a village surviving the winter and a village starving to death. By the time the Inca Empire rose to power in the 15th century, the potato had become a foundation of Andean civilization, so essential that the Inca reportedly measured units of time by how long it took to cook one. Now, that detail about timekeeping is one of those charming stories that gets repeated constantly in popular history and is difficult to verify with certainty, so take it as a flavorful tradition rather than settled fact. What is beyond dispute is that the potato fed an empire. Inca administrators used it as a form of tribute, storing enormous quantities in state warehouses to feed soldiers, laborers, and the population during lean years. It fueled the construction of roads, temples, and fortresses across a mountain empire that stretched more than 2,500 miles from north to south. And then, in the 1530s, Spanish conquistadors arrived, hunting for gold and silver, and largely ignored the crop that had actually sustained the empire they were busy destroying. Francisco Pizarro and his men were interested in precious metal, not root vegetables, and the conquest of the Inca Empire that followed was swift and devastating, killing the Emperor Atahualpa in 1533 and dismantling centuries of political and agricultural organization within a matter of years. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The Spanish did eventually bring potatoes back to Europe, likely sometime in the 1550s or 1560s, but almost nobody in Europe wanted anything to do with them. Europeans, it turned out, were deeply suspicious of this lumpy, dirt-covered root. It was not mentioned in the Bible, which mattered a great deal to 16th and 17th century Christians who believed that any legitimate food should have scriptural precedent. It grew underground, which struck many peasants as unnatural or even sinister. It belonged to the nightshade family, the same family as deadly nightshade, and Europeans were not wrong to be a little cautious, since the green, sun-exposed parts of a potato plant genuinely are toxic. In parts of France, the potato was blamed for causing leprosy. In some regions, it was accused of causing flatulence so severe that it was considered immoral. And no, that is not something anyone made up. That was a real belief held by real physicians and real clergymen across real corners of Europe for well over a century. In some German territories, rulers had to resort to outright decree to force farmers to plant it. Frederick the Great of Prussia, frustrated by his subjects' refusal to grow a crop he correctly believed could prevent famine, issued what became known as the Kartoffelbefehl, which translates roughly to the potato order, a royal command in the 1750s instructing farmers to plant potatoes or face punishment. According to popular accounts, Frederick eventually had to resort to a trick similar to the one Parmentier would later use in France, planting a royal potato field and stationing guards around it, hoping the appearance of value would spark curiosity and theft among his skeptical subjects. For a long stretch of European history, the potato was grown mostly as animal feed or as an emergency famine crop, something you turned to only when everything else had already failed. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything that happens later. The very qualities that made the potato strange to European elites, its ability to grow in poor soil, its resistance to bad weather, its enormous caloric yield per acre, were exactly the qualities that would eventually make it one of the most important crops in human history. It just took a very stubborn Frenchman to prove it. That Frenchman's name was Antoine Augustin Parmentier, a military pharmacist who was captured by Prussian forces during the 7 Years' War in the 1760s and held as a prisoner, where he was fed almost nothing but potatoes for an extended period. He survived. Not only did he survive, he came home convinced that the crop French farmers had largely dismissed as pig feed could actually solve France's chronic hunger problem. Parmentier spent the next 2 decades on what amounted to a one-man public relations campaign for the potato. He hosted dinners for celebrities and nobility that featured potatoes in every course. He reportedly gave Benjamin Franklin, then serving as the American ambassador to France, a bouquet of potato flowers, and gifted another bouquet to Marie Antoinette, who allegedly wore them in her hair. Whether every detail of these stories is historically precise remains debated among historians, since much of it comes from later retellings, but the broader campaign is extremely well documented. In one of his more theatrical moves, Parmentier planted a field of potatoes outside Paris and stationed armed guards around it during the day, only to withdraw the guards at night, deliberately encouraging local peasants to sneak in and steal the crop. The idea was simple, almost absurdly so. If something needed guarding, it must be valuable. It worked. Peasants stole the potatoes, planted them in their own fields, and within a generation, the potato had gone from feared curiosity to essential French staple. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. It laid the exact cultural groundwork that would make potatoes, and eventually fried potatoes, a defining feature of French and Belgian cuisine within a matter of decades. Meanwhile, quietly, in the river towns of what is now Belgium, something else was happening. Something with far less documentation and far more mythology attached to it. But something that food historians increasingly believe is the true birthplace of the French fry. The most widely repeated origin story goes like this. In the region around the Meuse River, in towns like Namur and Dinant, residents in the late 1600s had a beloved tradition of frying small fish caught fresh from the river. During the winter months, when the river froze over and fishing became impossible, local villagers supposedly began slicing potatoes into long strips shaped roughly like small fish and frying them in the same hot fat as a substitute for the fish they could no longer catch. Now, historians debate whether this exact version of the story is fully accurate, since the earliest written references to this legend do not appear until much later, and some scholars question whether potatoes were even widely cultivated in that specific region as early as the 1600s. But the fact that this story exists at all, deeply embedded in Belgian cultural identity for generations, tells you something important about how central fried potatoes had become to everyday life in the region by at least the mid to late 1700s. What is much less disputed is that by the early 1800s, street vendors throughout Belgium, particularly in Wallonia and later in Brussels, were selling fried potato strips as an inexpensive, filling, working-class food, served hot, salted, and eaten with the hands, often near markets, factories, and town squares. These strips were cut by hand, often unevenly, and fried in beef tallow or lard heated over open fires or simple stoves, then served hot, wrapped in scraps of paper, to laborers on their way to or from work. There was no seating. There was no menu. There was a cart, a fryer, salt, and a paper cone. And for a few coins, a working person could get something hot, filling, and satisfying enough to carry them through a long shift. This was not fine dining. This was fast food, more than a century before anyone used that term. Here is the detail that makes this story more interesting than a simple culinary footnote. Belgium in this era was not the country you would picture today. It had spent centuries under the control of Spain, then Austria, then briefly France under Napoleon, before finally becoming an independent kingdom in 1830. It was a small nation sitting directly between two much larger, more culturally dominant neighbors, France and the German states, and it spoke, depending on the region, either French or Dutch. This geography and linguistic reality would matter enormously nearly a century later. But for now, in the 1800s, it simply meant that Belgian fried potatoes existed largely in the shadow of French cuisine's much larger international reputation. France had chefs, cookbooks, and royal courts broadcasting its food culture to the rest of Europe. Belgium had market stalls and fritkoots, small wooden fry shacks that dotted town squares. The food was arguably just as good, arguably even more central to daily life, but it lacked the marketing machine. This imbalance is where the eventual mix-up over the name really takes root, decades before it actually happens. By the mid-1800s, fried potato culture had spread well beyond Belgium's borders, showing up in French cookbooks, English food writing, and eventually crossing the Atlantic. Thomas Jefferson, who served as the United States Minister to France in the 1780s before becoming president, developed a fondness for a French dish of potatoes served in the French manner, and a recipe attributed to his household from around 1802 describes potatoes cut into shavings or thin slices and fried, one of the earliest known written references to fried potatoes appearing in an American document. Jefferson reportedly served this dish at White House dinners, and it is often cited as one of the earliest introductions of fried potatoes to American audiences, though again, whether this specific recipe traces its lineage more directly to French or Belgian cooking traditions is genuinely difficult to untangle from the historical record, since both cultures were frying potatoes by this point and borrowing constantly from one another. What matters for this story is the label attached to it. It was already being called French. The confusion, in other words, did not start in the trenches of World War I. It started with an American president's dinner table more than a century earlier, and the war simply cemented a mistake that had already begun taking root. Here is the uncomfortable irony that the popular version of this story tends to skip over. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next. Because the story is about to head somewhere genuinely dark before it gets anywhere near a fast food counter. Potatoes, remember, had already reshaped European history once before, in one of the most devastating famines the modern world has ever recorded. By the 1840s, the potato had become the primary food source for an enormous portion of Ireland's rural poor, in part because a single acre of potatoes could feed a family in a way that grain simply could not, and in part because centuries of British colonial land policy had pushed Irish tenant farmers onto smaller and smaller plots of increasingly marginal land, where potatoes were often the only crop reliable enough to survive. In 1845, a water mold called Phytophthora infestans, likely arriving on ships from North America, began destroying potato crops across Ireland, turning healthy fields into blackened, rotting mush within days. The smell of decay reportedly hung over entire counties. This was not just an unfortunate crop failure. It became one of the deadliest famines in modern European history, a catastrophe compounded, and in the view of many historians, deliberately worsened, by British government policy that continued exporting grain and livestock out of Ireland even as its own population starved. Roughly 1 million people died of starvation and related disease between 1845 and 1852. Roughly 1 million more emigrated, many to the United States, permanently altering the demographic makeup of American cities like Boston and New York. 1 million dead. 1 million more forced to flee their homeland. Entire villages in the west of Ireland were emptied out within a handful of years, their populations either buried in mass graves or scattered across the Atlantic on overcrowded, disease-ridden ships that came to be known as coffin ships because so many passengers did not survive the crossing. British officials in London, including men who held direct authority over famine relief policy, continued to argue that intervening too aggressively in Irish food markets would violate principles of free trade, even as the death toll climbed into the hundreds of thousands. Sir Charles Trevelyan, the senior civil servant most directly responsible for administering British relief efforts, reportedly described the famine at one point as a mechanism for reducing what he considered Ireland's surplus population, a statement that historians still cite today as evidence of just how much ideology, not just blight, shaped the scale of the tragedy. This is not the origin story of the French fry, but it is essential context, because it explains something crucial about why, by the time fried potatoes crossed into wider European and American food culture, the potato itself was already viewed by millions of ordinary people not as a delicacy, but as a hard-won, hard-earned staple of survival. A food you respected because you had watched, sometimes within living memory, what happened when it failed. This is where the story turns from tragedy back towards something closer to comedy, because the actual moment fried potatoes get permanently, mistakenly, and irreversibly branded as French happens roughly 7 decades later, in the middle of another catastrophe entirely, the First World War. By 1914, Belgium found itself in almost exactly the wrong place at almost exactly the wrong time. A small, neutral kingdom sitting directly in the path of the German army's planned invasion route into France. German forces violated Belgian neutrality within the first weeks of the war, and Belgium, despite its small size, put up fierce and unexpectedly stubborn resistance, delaying the German advance long enough to have real strategic consequences for the rest of the war. The occupation that followed was brutal. Tens of thousands of Belgian civilians were killed, deported for forced labor, or displaced from their homes over the 4 years that followed, and much of the country's industrial and agricultural infrastructure was devastated by the fighting that continued along its western edge for the entire duration of the war. It was into this landscape, ravaged, occupied, and desperate, that American soldiers began arriving in large numbers starting in 1917, after the United States formally entered the war. And here is the detail that makes this whole mix-up almost inevitable in hindsight. Belgium is a linguistically divided country. Roughly the southern half of the country, the region known as Wallonia, speaks French as its primary language, while the northern half, Flanders, speaks Dutch. American soldiers stationed near the Belgian front lines, cold, exhausted, and thousands of miles from home, encountered Belgian vendors and Belgian troops who were, in many cases, speaking French to them. These American soldiers, most of whom had likely never studied European geography closely enough to know exactly where the front line sat relative to the French and Belgian border, simply assumed that anyone speaking French must be French. They ate the fried potatoes sold by these vendors, loved them, and carried the name French fries home with them when the war ended in November of 1918. It was a small, understandable, almost forgivable mistake made by exhausted young men in one of the most brutal wars in human history. It also turned out to be permanent. Once American soldiers returned home using that name, it spread through American English with no meaningful resistance, and no popular movement ever emerged strong enough to correct it. This is the part that tends to surprise people the most. Belgium, to this day, still does not have a strong, internationally recognized claim to the dish most linguists and food historians now believe it likely invented, or, at the very least, was crucial in popularizing centuries before France laid any serious claim to it. Meanwhile, back in Belgium itself, largely unaffected by what Americans across the ocean were choosing to call the dish, fried potato culture kept thriving on its own terms, evolving into something distinct and genuinely its own. The small wooden and later metal fry stalls known as fritcots became a fixture of nearly every Belgian town, serving fries in paper cones, traditionally fried not once but twice, first at a lower temperature to cook the potato through, and then a second time at a much higher temperature to create the crisp, golden exterior that Belgian fry culture is still famous for today. This double frying technique, whenever it was precisely developed, represents a genuine culinary innovation, one that most historians agree distinguishes true Belgian-style fries from many other national variations, and one that many high-end restaurants around the world still credit explicitly to Belgian tradition. Belgians typically serve their fries not with plain ketchup, but with a thick, rich, mayonnaise-based sauce, a detail that still confuses plenty of American tourists ordering fries in Brussels for the first time. In 2017, Belgium even formally applied to UNESCO to have fry culture, and specifically the frietcult tradition, recognized as part of the country's protected intangible cultural heritage, a request driven at least in part by decades of quiet frustration over watching a food many Belgians consider a national treasure get permanently attached to their much larger, much louder neighbor's name. So, if Belgium likely invented it, and France mostly just got the naming credit by accident, what actually turned the French fry into a global industrial phenomenon? That part of the story does not happen in Europe at all. It happens in 20th century America, and it happens because of industrialization, war, and one specific Idaho farmer who was, by most accounts, a fairly ordinary man, who happened to be extraordinarily good at solving practical problems. Fried potatoes had been present in American food culture in a scattered regional way since at least the mid-1800s, showing up in cookbooks, at street fairs, and eventually at diners and lunch counters across the country in the early 20th century. But for decades, fries remained a labor-intensive small-batch item, something restaurants made fresh by hand, one batch at a time, using whatever potatoes happened to be locally available and reasonably fresh. This changed dramatically in the middle of the 20th century, driven by two forces converging almost simultaneously: the post-war explosion of the American fast food industry and a series of technological breakthroughs in food freezing and processing. The single most consequential figure in this transformation was a man named J.R. Simplot, an Idaho farmer and businessman who had built a substantial agricultural empire supplying dehydrated potatoes and onions to the United States military during the Second World War, a contract that alone reportedly generated tens of millions of dollars for his company and helped establish him as one of the most powerful agricultural suppliers in the American West. In the 1950s, Simplot's company began experimenting seriously with flash freezing technology applied specifically to raw cut potato strips, refining a process that allowed French fries to be par-cooked, frozen, shipped, stored for months, and then finished with a quick fry at any restaurant anywhere without requiring a trained cook to peel and slice fresh potatoes on site every single day. This is the part that does not get enough credit in most tellings of fast food history. Freezing French fries was not simply a matter of convenience. It fundamentally restructured the entire economics of the restaurant industry, because it meant that a fry-based menu item could now be centrally manufactured at enormous scale, shipped nationally, and prepared to an identical standard in Boise, Idaho, and in Orlando, Florida on the very same day. Ray Kroc, the businessman who transformed McDonald's from a single California hamburger stand into a national franchise empire beginning in the mid-1950s, understood almost immediately what this technology meant for his growing chain. McDonald's had originally prepared its fries fresh, on-site from raw potatoes, a process that was time-consuming, inconsistent from location to location, and dependent on the quality of whatever potatoes a particular franchise happened to source locally. Kroc reportedly met with J.R. Simplot personally in the 1960s, and by most accounts the two men, both self-made businessmen with a shared instinct for scale, struck the deal on a handshake rather than a lengthy negotiation, an arrangement that would eventually make McDonald's one of the single largest purchasers of frozen potato products on the entire planet. By switching to Simplot's frozen fries, McDonald's was able to guarantee an identical fry in taste, texture, and appearance at every single one of its locations, an enormously important detail for a company whose entire business model depended on delivering a completely predictable experience to customers, regardless of which city or state they happen to be standing in. Think about that for a second. The crispy, salty fry that generations of customers came to think of as distinctly, quintessentially American was, at its industrial core, a frozen Idaho potato, cut by machine, cooked using a process refined by an Idaho farmer, built on a food that had almost certainly originated in Belgian river towns and was named after France due to a linguistic mix-up during the First World War. Not one part of that supply chain is French, and yet, French fries remains to this day the dominant name for the dish almost everywhere English is spoken. Here is the twist that most people never think about. For decades, McDonald's cooked its fries in a specific blend of beef tallow and cottonseed oil, a formula that many longtime customers, and later food critics and nutrition scientists, credited as the actual secret behind McDonald's fries tasting noticeably different and to many palates noticeably better than competitors' versions. In 1990, facing mounting public pressure over saturated fat content and cholesterol concerns, McDonald's switched to a vegetable oil blend, a change that triggered years of ongoing customer complaints and even nostalgia campaigns from people who insisted the flavor had never been the same since. This was not just about seasoning food. The specific fat used to fry a potato turned out to have measurable, detectable consequences on public perception of an entire multinational brand, something almost nobody would have predicted from a food this simple sounding on paper. Decades later, food scientists studying flavor chemistry pointed out that beef tallow carries natural compounds that vegetable oil simply does not replicate, which helps explain why so many longtime customers insisted, correctly as it turned out, that something real had changed, even when the company's public statements downplayed the difference. The switch away from beef tallow was not McDonald's only high-profile fry controversy. In the 1980s and 90s, nutrition advocates increasingly criticized the fast food industry for its reliance on partially hydrogenated oils, which contain trans fats linked to increased risk of heart disease. McDonald's spent years promising to reformulate its frying oil to remove trans fats, a process complicated by the fact that any new oil blend had to replicate the taste, texture, and shelf stability of the old formula closely enough that customers would not notice a difference. The company finally completed the transition in the mid-2000s, a reformulation that reportedly took internal food scientists years of testing to get right, underscoring just how much precise chemistry sits behind a food most people assume is about as simple as cooking gets. By the 21st century, the scale of global fry production had become almost difficult to comprehend. The United States alone produces well over 20 billion pounds of potatoes annually, and a substantial share of that crop, grown heavily in states like Idaho, Washington, and Wisconsin, is destined specifically for frozen fry production. Globally, potatoes are now the fourth most consumed food crop in the world, trailing only rice, wheat, and corn, with countries including China, India, Russia, and Ukraine joining the United States among the largest producers on the planet. McDonald's alone reportedly sells fries in roughly 100 countries, and industry estimates place the global frozen potato products market, which includes fries as its single largest category, at well over $60 billion in annual value. But fries are far more than just a food, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. During the Second World War, the potato was quietly repurposed as a source of industrial alcohol used in explosives manufacturing. During the Cold War, the Central Intelligence Agency reportedly studied potato-based rations for their caloric density and portability. And in one of the stranger footnotes in modern diplomatic history, in 2003, when France declined to support the American-led invasion of Iraq, members of the United States Congress became so irritated that cafeterias in the House of Representatives officially, if briefly, renamed French fries Freedom Fries on their menus, an entirely symbolic gesture rooted in an entirely mistaken premise, since the dish being renamed almost certainly was not French in origin to begin with. The irony of Congress attempting to punish France by renaming a Belgian food is, frankly, difficult to improve upon. Modern potato science has continued advancing in directions that would have been unrecognizable to Antoine-Augustin Parmentier or to the anonymous fritcot vendors of 19th-century Wallonia. Agricultural researchers have developed potato varieties specifically engineered for optimal fry length, sugar content, and moisture level, since sugar content in a raw potato directly affects how evenly and how dark a fry browns during cooking. Companies now use infrared scanning and artificial intelligence-powered sorting lines to detect and discard potatoes with internal defects invisible to the human eye, at speeds of many tons per hour. Researchers have even explored genetically modified potato varieties designed specifically to bruise less easily during shipping and to produce lower levels of a chemical called acrylamide, which forms naturally when starchy foods are fried or baked at high temperatures and has drawn scrutiny from health regulators in multiple countries. None of this technology existed when Belgian villagers were allegedly frying potato strips in place of small river fish during a frozen winter. And yet, the basic shape, the basic method, cutting a starchy tuber into strips and submerging it in hot fat, has remained essentially unchanged for roughly 3.5 centuries. Here is a fact that tends to genuinely surprise people. Potatoes have flown in space. NASA and the International Potato Center in Peru have spent years researching whether potatoes could theoretically be grown on Mars, using simulated Martian soil and controlled atmospheric conditions in laboratory experiments conducted throughout the 2010s, largely because the crop's caloric density, adaptability to poor soil, and relatively short growing cycle make it one of the more plausible candidates for feeding astronauts on a long-duration mission. Think about that for a second. A crop that European aristocrats once refused to eat because it was not mentioned in scripture is now considered, by serious agricultural scientists, one of humanity's best candidates for growing food on another planet. From feared curiosity to famine crop to fast food staple to potential Martian agriculture, the potato's reputation has traveled a genuinely strange arc across 5 centuries. It was there in the frozen river towns of 17th-century Belgium, sold to hungry villagers as a cheap substitute for fish. It was there in Antoine-Augustin Parmentier's staged nighttime potato thefts outside Paris, quietly rehabilitating the reputation of an entire crop. It was there on Thomas Jefferson's White House dinner table, already, mistakenly, wearing a French label more than a century before anyone fought a war over it. It was there in the blackened, rotting potato fields of famine-era Ireland, a stark reminder of exactly how much power this humble root actually held over life and death. It was there in the mud and cold of the First World War, handed to exhausted American soldiers by Belgian vendors speaking French, in the exact linguistic accident that cemented a misnomer for more than a century to come. It was there in J.R. Simplot's Idaho freezing plants and in Ray Kroc's national franchise empire, transformed from a hand-cut regional specialty into one of the most mass-produced, standardized foods on the entire planet. And it is there right now, most likely within arm's reach of millions of people at this very moment, sitting in a paper sleeve or a cardboard container, salted, golden, and utterly unremarkable to look at. Not bad, honestly, for a lumpy, dirt-covered tuber that most of Europe once considered barely fit for pigs, wrapped in the name of a country that almost certainly did not invent it, carried across an ocean by soldiers who simply misheard where they were standing. The French fry was never really French. It never was. But maybe that is fitting in its own strange way, for a food whose entire history is one long story of mistaken identity, stolen credit, and quiet, working-class ingenuity finally getting its due, even if the world still spells its name wrong. If this is the kind of story you enjoy, do me a favor and hit subscribe. Let me know in the comments which part of this history surprised you the most, and I will see you in the next one.